Hey everyone, in this video we're going to talk about the gastrointestinal system. This is basically the digestive system, right? And the gastrointestinal system has several components that we're going to be thinking about. We got to start with the pharynx, that is the oral and nasal cavity that leads to the esophagus. The esophagus is that flexible, expandable tube that goes down your throat and to your stomach. Then we've got the stomach itself, right? And then beyond the stomach, we're going to have the small intestines. And then after that, we're going to have the large intestines or colon. And then we're going to have the rectum. That's the whole system. We often talk about that as the alimentary canal. Alimentary means to nourish. So this is the canal that provides nourishment, alimentary canal. And it has some interesting commonalities to it. Each part of that system has a unique function, of course, but then we're going to see that there's some common traits to the whole characterization of the alimentary canal. Okay, so that's it. In addition, in the next video, we're going to talk about some of the accessory organs that are necessary for proper digestion. That's going to include things like the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas that provide enzymes or other support functions that allow us to digest and process food properly. Okay, before we begin, big picture here, what is the point of the gastrointestinal system? Well, basically, we want to be able to digest food. More specifically, we want to be able to take solid food that we ingest and take out the small bits and pieces of that, break it down into tiny little molecules, and absorb those into our bloodstream. We call that absorption. That's basically what we mean when we generally say digestion. Okay, so the first bit of that is going to be to take those solid chunks, whatever, piece of hot dog, piece of hamburger bun, French fry, and break it down into tiny little pieces. And that's going to have a mechanical component and a chemical component. And then we need to create plenty of contact space, plenty of surface area for interaction between our circulating blood and these newly exposed small particles of nutrients and minerals, so that the little molecules of nutrients and minerals can make their way into the circulating blood. So that's going to require a large surface area and close contact between circulation and the food. And then we need to take that and bring it in a useful way to all the organs that are going to help process this and deal with the unneeded or problematic bits of things that we eat, the things that we can't digest or that are problematic from a metabolic function, whatnot. All those, big picture, are what we need to do. And then, how do we do that in more specific terms? Well, we have chemical digestion. And chemical digestion basically means we're either going to take something that's a strong acid and tear apart the food that we eat to break it up into smaller pieces, or possibly we're going to take an enzyme to catalyze or enable a chemical reaction that pulls apart or disassembles a molecular structure that allows us to absorb components. And by that I mean small components. So like we eat, I don't know, meat, and meat has proteins. We absorb some of those proteins, but basically what we do is we break apart the proteins into the constituent parts, amino acids, and then we rebuild the proteins we need with those components. So we are really tearing this apart into its smallest parts. So chemical digestion is going to allow us to do that. Mechanical digestion is the mechanical tearing and ripping, and that begins in the mouth where you chew up what we call mastication. We chew up the food particles into smaller and smaller bits. But your stomach then also churns and twists to break apart mechanically the food. And your intestines do this as well. So we're going to use some mechanical stress and strain and shear forces to tear apart food into smaller parts. Peristalsis is going to be involved, and that's the rhythmic movement of muscles that will cause your digested foods or your food intake to move through this alimentary canal. So we don't rely on gravity. Like if you, for example, eat a hot dog upside down, it's still going to your stomach because you've got a rhythmic, sequential movement of muscle tissue, even in your esophagus, that's going to move it down to your stomach and through your GI system, etc., right? So you don't stop digesting when you lay on your back because gravity's not pushing things down to your rectum. The muscles are systematically and rhythmically moving things down. And in fact, a version of that is also segmentation, where you're going to see certain muscle groups in your intestines actually working on some of the food to break it apart mechanically and mix it up to allow better contact with circulating blood. So the basic version is your intestines are going to be surrounded by circulating blood that's going to want to absorb all of these useful nutrients, electrolytes, and other things like that. And to do that, you've got to make sure you have got good, full contact between the stuff you've ingested, the nutrients, and the circulating blood. And that's going to require a really large surface area. I'll get to that in a minute. And it's going to require good connection and mixing. And so we sometimes have segmentation, which is parts of your intestine sort of mixing and twisting things up to allow that to happen. And that's part of what you hear when you listen to GI sounds. So if you've ever put like your ear to somebody's belly or a stethoscope to somebody's belly, you can always, when they're alive, hear the gastrointestinal system working and moving, etc. And that's gases and muscles moving food along the pathway because you're always digesting stuff. And then lastly, we have the term absorption, which is the actual absorption of the nutrients, those useful molecules, from your food process into your circulatory system, right? All those, big picture, are steps in that, or key components of that digestive process. I also mentioned that that whole alimentary canal also has several similarities, which are kind of interesting. One is that throughout the alimentary canal, the surrounding tissue is basically the same. It's going to have 4 layers to it. The first layer on the inside, inner lumen, is the mucosa. And the mucosal layer, as you can imagine, is a layer that's going to have a lot of what we call goblet cells that are going to secrete mucus. And the reason for that is both as a lubrication, but also as a protection, because in certain parts of your body, because of chemical digestion, it's going to be very acidic. So the mucus can also protect your stomach, for example, or your intestines from the digestive juices. Now, if this doesn't make sense to you, think of it this way. You've got strong acids in your stomach to digest, to break apart, to chemically disassemble proteins. And yet, your stomach is made up of proteins. Why aren't those juices tearing apart your stomach? Well, we'll learn in the next video that at times they can, but they aren't doing it in general because there's a thick, reliable mucosal layer on the inside that protects the surface of your stomach from this acid. So that's the mucosal layer. Inside the mucosal layer, by the way, as a part of the mucosal layer, is a muscularis mucosa, that's what it's called, a small muscular element to the mucosal layer. And what that does is that kind of holds it together with a lot of folds and plies in it, so that it has a larger surface area than you would guess just from its length. I'll get to that in a bit, but it's interesting to point out here that depending on which textbook you read, when you look up the length of the small intestine, you're going to get a number that's crazy different. Some are going to say like 10 feet, some are going to say 20-something feet, and the difference is whether or not the person's dead or not. What I mean is there's muscles in that inner lining that hold everything together and create a lot of folds. When the person dies, they lose that muscular tone and everything gets loose. And so suddenly what was a 10 or 12 foot intestine becomes a much longer intestine as it loses its muscular tone. So there's that's the mucosal layer. There's the submucosal layer just underneath that, and that's the layer where absorption is going to happen. So that's where you got a lot of blood vessels and lymphatic vessels that are moving through the tissue and basically ready to absorb, to transport all those absorbed nutrients to your circulation. You've got underneath that the muscularis layer. That's the more significant muscular layer that holds everything in tone and together and allows for peristalsis, that rhythmic motion that moves food down the canal. And then around that, you've got a serosa layer, and that's a layer of tough connective tissue that sort of holds the whole thing together and protects it to some degree. So there's that in terms of tissue. Something else to understand in terms of tissue is the reminder of the peritoneum. And you might remember when we talked about the kidneys, I mentioned briefly the peritoneum. That's this membrane, this layer of tissue, this membrane that encloses the abdomen and all the gastrointestinal systems. So everything we've talked about so far, the liver, the liver, the stomach, the intestines, all that is surrounded by the peritoneum, by a peritoneal membrane that holds everything together. And it's worth noting this because this sort of separates the GI system from the rest of the body. And when this gets infected, we call it peritonitis. And peritonitis can be pretty significant and pretty deadly. And one of the things we're going to talk about when we talk about dysfunctions of the GI system later is that you can have a leak. You can have, for example, an ulceration or something else that allows some of the contents that should be inside your GI system to get outside your GI system into the peritoneal cavity. And that can be deadly. And in fact, until recently, it was deadly. Really, until just a couple of decades ago, to have that kind of leak into the peritoneal cavity, a peritonitis, we would call it, had a very high death rate. Now we've gotten much better at quickly and aggressively dealing with that and avoiding significant infection. So the death rate ranges from like 30 to 40%, which is not awesome, but it's a lot better than it used to be. So keep in mind that peritoneal cavity. Okay. The other thing worth mentioning about the gastrointestinal system, which is kind of interesting, and it should be obvious, but again, we don't always think about this kind of stuff, is that there's a lot of regulatory mechanisms involved in this process. What I mean is there's like mechanical receptors that sense things like movement, and baroreceptors that sense things like change in pressure. There's chemoreceptors that sense things like chemical composition. There is osmotic receptors that sense things like different osmolarity. And all of these regulate the GI system. So the GI system doesn't just sort of run automatically, thoughtlessly, and without controls. Rather, it senses what you've eaten, how much you've eaten, the contents of what you've eaten, and as it processes, as it breaks it down step by step, and we'll talk about that in a bit, step by step through a chemical and mechanical process, it's measuring things like osmolarity and size and chemical composition, and using that to determine what chemicals are going to be needed to break this down, what kind of absorption process needs to take place, etc. So this is all a fairly significantly measured system that has messages sent through basically to glands to secrete certain enzymes, etc. So gastrin, for example, comes to mind. Gastrin is the main digestive enzyme. So when you eat something in your stomach senses that you've eaten something. It releases gastrin, and gastrin is going to cause a response of hydrochloric acid in your stomach to start breaking that down. It's going to stimulate the secretion of gastric acids in your stomach, and by the way, mucosa to protect your stomach in order to start the digestive process. Cholecystokinin is another one that comes to mind. Cholecystokinin is a GI hormone that is pretty significantly released, especially when you have fatty foods or other kinds of foods, meant to allow or stimulate the secretion from your pancreas of enzymes or bile that allow for the digestion of otherwise difficult to digest nutrients. And we'll talk about those in greater detail. The point I want to make here is that the endocrine system that we talked about before, that signaling system, is not separate from the GI system. They all kind of connect and work together in different kinds of ways. And the GI system is regulated. It's got sensors in it. It's got neurosensors in it. It's got endocrine signaling compounds in it that allow for the regulation of the digestion process. Okay, so you eat something. It goes down your esophagus and it goes into your stomach. What's the stomach look like there? Well, most people think that the stomach is where digestion happens. Not really, and it's certainly not where absorption happens. The stomach has two valves on it. On one side, it's got an esophageal sphincter because it connects with the esophagus. And there's a sphincter there that controls the back reflux of these highly acidic compounds in your stomach back into your esophagus. So later we'll talk about when people get heartburn or reflux, gastro reflux, and that's basically stomach acid making its way back in the esophagus. And that first sphincter, the esophageal sphincter, should stop that from happening. On the other side of the stomach, there's a sphincter as well. That's the pyloric sphincter. And that allows for the controlled release of the contents of the stomach into your small intestine. So you can't just let the stuff in the stomach flow into the small intestine. It has to go in small little bits. And so basically that sphincter is meant to allow for small little squirts of chyme. That's the digestive liquid juices of the food you've eaten from your stomach to squirt in the intestines at a rate at which the intestines can handle it. In between, of course, is the stomach. And you can see from this image that the stomach has 3 different crossing layers of muscles and is actually highly active. So it doesn't just stand still. It stands still on either side where it's connected, but in between, it does sort of like rolling motions of muscular tissue that allow for some mixing and twisting and mechanical digestion, as well as the strong chemical digestion, because it's filled with hydrochloric acid that's tearing apart the things that you've eaten. The interesting thing about the stomach is not only is it highly active, creating what we call mixing waves that literally like twist, or not twist, but flux back and forth like this. I'm not doing it justice, but flux back and forth like this, mixing and churning the food in your stomach. Not only does it do that, but it can stretch remarkably. So when it's small, it's about the size of your fist. It has a very small inner volume to it. But when you start eating, that can expand by up to 75 times into a relatively large vessel. And when it's small, you get what are called rugae, which are basically these folds in your stomach that when it expands, sort of can become absorbed by the stretching action. So if you look at a stomach when it's relatively empty or in normal conditions, or I don't know, if you go to the butcher and you look at a cow's stomach, it'll have all these folds on it. The surface will look a little bit like a brain surface, and that's because it needs to be able to stretch. And when it stretches, those rugae get stretched out, right? So it's basically a sac with a lot of muscles in it that's highly active in terms of motion, that can fill with hydrochloric acid and have a protective mucus layer inside of that and churn and mix things to tear and break them up. You might say that's part of the digestive process, but I think in common terms, when we think about digestion, we think about the actual absorption of nutrients, and no absorption of nutrients is happening in the stomach. Highly mobile, very stretchy, lots of mucus in there. In fact, that alkaline mucus that neutralizes the acid and protects your stomach, basically you could see it. So again, if you ever looked at like a stomach lining, I'm just kind of thinking about this, it has what are called gastric pits on it. So it looks like you took like, I don't know, a needle and just poked a bunch of holes in it. And those gastric pits are what allow for the aggressive release from gastric glands of the alkaline mucus that protects the stomach from the acid. Otherwise, the stomach would just digest itself, right? Okay, from the stomach, goes through the pyloric valve. Pyloric valve, pyo meaning sort of fire or energy or whatever. So pyloric valve is the valve that basically isolates the aggressiveness of the acid from the intestines that couldn't handle that kind of acid. But what we're getting then is chyme, and that chyme is squirting out of the stomach in sort of a rhythmic session in small bits at a time. And there's a couple of reasons for that, by the way. One is that the small intestines couldn't handle a large amount of food at a time. Now, you eat food all at once, but the small intestines have to handle in small little bits. So one of the goals of the stomach is to hold on to that food and allow it to go into the small intestines bit by bit at a rate that can be digested. The other, which is interesting but has to do with osmolarity. If we allowed the stomach's contents to go into the intestines in large quantities, that would be a highly osmolar content. In other words, there'd be a lot of stuff compared to the amount of water that's in that contents. And that would absorb moisture from the surrounding tissue, which could cause you to kind of be dehydrated. It would basically suck all the fluid into your gastrointestinal tract. That wouldn't be good. So by putting it in there in small bits, you can allow for the absorption without creating this osmolar problem. Okay, one interesting thing about the small intestine is it's not small. It's actually, again, about 10 feet long, or 3 meters long in a living person. In a dead person, it's significantly longer than that because it loses muscular tone. The reason we call it the small intestine is because its lumen is small. It's fairly small around as compared to the large intestine, which is much larger. But the small intestine is made up of 3 parts. I don't expect you to memorize these, but I want you to have heard of them before. It starts with the duodenum, which is about 18 inches long, and then the larger part is the jejunum. And then a smaller portion after that, that's a couple feet long, is the ileum. And each one of these is a little bit different. As I said before, the entire tract sort of has the same kind of tissue in it, but it varies in terms of function. So the duodenum absorbs different nutrients than the jejunum is to some degree, and the ileum absorbs different nutrients than the other two as well. So they each have sort of their specialized function. But as it goes through these portions of the small intestine that mechanically look different or physiologically look different, and I should say anatomically look different, they also have different physiological functions. There, that's what I meant to say. Okay. One interesting thing about this is we need a really large surface area. Why? Well, I've hit on surface area before when we talked about lungs and other kinds of things. But the reality is we've got all this food, all these nutrients that are broken down now into smaller molecules, and the small intestines are going to break them down some more. We talked about that, right? And then they're going to move them with peristalsis, move them down the small intestines, and cause absorption. And that means you need to have close contact between the circulating blood, where these molecules will get absorbed, and this chyme, these digestive nutrients, or digesting nutrients, I should say, right? To allow for absorption, we need a large surface area. Now, if I took your small intestines and just took them out of you and cut them open and laid them flat, you'd have a relatively small surface area. Surface area that's something like, I don't know, maybe 2 feet by 2 feet, something like that, like this size surface area if I laid your intestines flat. However, the intestines have certain characteristics to them that make the area much larger than that. They have, first off, circular folds in them. We call them plica. And these circular folds basically mean that the surface, if you'd like, or the wall of the intestines has a lot of folds and bends in it that create a much larger surface area. That's what the plica are. Here, I'm putting up some images as well that'll help you visualize this. And then on that surface that already has all of these folds on it, we put up hair-like vascularized projections. So imagine like, I don't know, microscopic fingers. And those fingers have blood vessels in them. They basically stick up. Those are called villi. And those villi are like a shag carpet kind of surface to the inside of your intestines, which you can imagine then increases the surface area that much more. And then on the cell walls, very microscopically, the cell walls themselves have what we call microvilli, little extensions of the cell walls themselves that allow even more surface area. The result of all these 3 different dynamics of surface area expansion is that the actual surface area of your small intestine is roughly something like 45 feet by 45 feet. In other words, it went from 2 feet by 2 feet to the size of a tennis court. Now, if I then eat a hamburger, mix it up with acid, break it apart, mix it up with my hands and make it into like a smooth malt, add some water to it, make it very, very mushy, break it up into tiny, tiny pieces, and then take that hamburger and spread it out over the surface area of a tennis court, you can imagine that that would allow for some absorption. That's the way your GI system works. And that's what the small intestines do, is they create a huge surface area and then they create a mixing action that allows contact between circulating blood and all the nutrients that you have absorbed by eating that hamburger. Okay, that's the absorption process. Again, that's going to happen in squirts. So we're going to get the chyme coming out of your stomach. We call that process, by the way, I don't know if I mentioned this term before, gastric emptying. And I did mention the mixing waves before. That's going to squirt in, and it's going to move then through peristalsis, through rhythmic contractions of your smooth muscles around your GI system, moving the food all the way down. And different parts of the small intestines are right down here. Oh, you can't see them. There you go. Right down there. Those are the small intestines. And the large intestines go above that. You can see in the image I'm popping up there now, which is a much better image. That's going to be that mechanical digestion process. Almost all the food you digest is going to be absorbed in the small intestines. About 80% of the electrolytes, 90% of the water is absorbed in the small intestines, and almost all the other nutrients. There's some variation in that. B12 gets absorbed by the ileum, for example, and let's see, what else? Salts get absorbed by the ileum. The jejunum has some specialty with carbohydrates and some protein, so that's the middle part of your small intestine. So as I mentioned before, different parts of your small intestine have different specialties to them, but basically your small intestine is going to allow for the digestion of all this stuff. And then that chyme is going to move into your large intestine. Your large intestine is that pathway that moves over the top and then to the back of your body to your rectum. That's going to now take what's left, which is largely indigestible food residue, things you can't digest or don't want to digest or whatever, and pack that in. And then what is the point? Here's an image of that large intestine. What is the point of the large intestine? Not really to allow digestion. Very little digestion happens in that large intestine, also called the colon. What happens mostly there is it allows you to poop more regularly. If you didn't have it, remember, the pyloric valve is releasing chyme in little squirts consistently for hours after you've eaten something. It would not be awesome if then your rectum just released little squirts as you walked along for 2 or 3 hours after you ate that hamburger. Your colon is going to absorb all that. And it's going to allow for the absorption of more water and some other nutrients, but mostly it's just going to allow you to create more consistent and solid stool. So instead of having sort of liquidy, sloppy, diarrhea-like chyme released from your rectum, it's going to actually allow it to build up so that you can poop at more regular, convenient intervals. And you can imagine why, by the way, in terms of sort of evolution, this makes sense. It's kind of hard to run from predators or capture prey or get anything done if you're constantly pooping. The saber-toothed tigers will know where to find you if you're constantly pooping, right? So in evolutionary terms, there's a benefit to having a colon. Having said that, could you live without a colon? Oh, yeah. Yeah. It would affect your digestion to some degree, but it's done all the time. A colonoscopy, colonectomy, is the removal of the colon. Colonoscopy is a scoping of the colon. Colonectomy is a removal of the colon. And when that happens, we've got a couple different options for how we fix things. Sometimes a surgeon will just take the small intestines and connect them to the rectum and kind of make a little bit of a colon out of part of the small intestines to basically allow you to poop somewhat more regularly. Sometimes that's called a J pouch because it sort of has a drop characteristic to it. And more commonly now is we'll put in a little port. So if you have a removal of your colon, we'll actually put in a colostomy bag that basically allows for what's left of undigested food to gather in a pouch outside your body. Not a pretty idea, I know, but if somebody has some severe dysfunction that requires the removal of the colon, we can do that, and the person can live a reasonably productive, healthy, happy, long life with a port and a plastic pouch that collects the waste rather than a colon that does it on the outside. So the colon is not strictly necessary, but you get the idea here. It allows for more regular, consistent pooping. Okay. The other thing that's worth pointing out is the appendix, because you've heard of this before. What's the point of the appendix? There is debate. One fairly compelling argument that's happened recently shows that the appendix may actually have a benefit in repopulating bacteria in your colon. You see, your colon, your large intestines, have a whole colony of bacteria to them, what we call a bacterial flora. I'm going to get back to the appendix, but I want to cover this first. There are trillions of live bacteria in your colon, and they basically have a symbiotic relationship with you. There's probably about 700 species of bacteria there. So it's this whole wide universe of bacteria that are living in your colon. And they generally don't harm you, and in fact, can be helpful. They stay in your gut, and they serve the function of supporting your gastrointestinal system. And there are T cells there as well that basically inspect these bacteria and other things. And there's a mucosal barrier there. The T cells, just to finish at that point, are inspecting for antigens, and if they find anything problematic, your immune system will respond, right? But in normal conditions, this bacterial flora live extensively in your gut. The reason I'm pointing this out is that these are beneficial, and there's some idea now that possibly one of the benefits of an appendix, which is just this small extension, if you'd like, where your small intestine reaches your colon, one possible benefit there is that it's sort of a holding point for bacteria, so that if for some reason you have some kind of infection and your bacterial flora, that whole colony gets compromised, you've got bacteria in your appendix that can much more rapidly repopulate the colon. Maybe. Another idea, and these are not mutually exclusive, is that the appendix is left over from a time when you needed to eat things that you don't need to eat anymore, like grasses, for example. We don't eat grasses and can't digest grasses. But it could be that our ancestors were better able to digest certain types of grasses, and the appendix may have provided a utility in that process. What we do know now is that if that appendix gets jammed up and inflamed, it can create some real problems. And so people who have had appendicitis, an inflammation of the appendix, and had to have an appendectomy. And since the appendix doesn't have any major significant function in our everyday lives now, removing it is really no big deal. In fact, this is just an aside, but there's an island, I think it's off the coast of Australia somewhere though, but it's a fairly remote place that doesn't have full medical facilities, where if you want to move there, you have to have your appendix removed ahead of time, because if you ever had an appendicitis, you'd die, because what will happen? Well, it will burst, and then the contents of your GI system will go into your pericardial space and create pericarditis, which will be deadly because you won't have any kind of medical help. So what's the point then of the large intestine? To recap all this, it collects all this chyme. It allows for the reabsorption of few nutrients, mostly water. so allows for the solidification of the chyme. Most water, by the way, is absorbed in the small intestine, but this is the final stage that sort of desiccates it even more to allow it to be a solid. And it allows you to poop fairly regularly. Some people poop 1 or 2 more times a day. Some people poop just a few times a week. Either of those is fine. And basically, that mass will linger in your colon for somewhere between 12 and 24 hours, build up to the point where then you feel through baroreceptors, I need to poop. And at the end of that colon is going to be then 2 sphincters, one that is a smooth muscle sphincter and one that is your skeletal muscle sphincter. In other words, one that you control and one that you don't control, that are going to hold back the poop at your rectum. And this is why, just as we were talking about the urinary system, you have some control over when you poop, but you don't always have full control over when you poop, because there's 2 sphincters there, and if that smooth muscle sphincter opens up on its own, you may not be able to hold it back with your skeletal muscle sphincter, depending on the kind of pressure we're talking about, right? And maybe you've experienced that. Okay, so to basically recap all of that, you ingest food, you crunch it up. It goes down your esophagus spreads out a little bit, and then it goes through the esophageal valve into your stomach. Your stomach has a lot of muscle tissue that mix it around and expose it to a lot of hydrochloric acid while protecting the walls with a mucosal barrier. It then creates chyme, and that squirts into your small intestines. Your small intestines then allow for absorption. They have a huge surface area to them, and they also have muscular tissue in them, just as the stomach did, as the entire alimentary canal does, that allow for peristalsis to move through and also allows for some mixing action. And the villi, microvilli, and plica allow for a lot of surface area, as big as a tennis court, to allow interaction between circulating blood and the nutrients in this chyme to allow the blood to absorb those nutrients, right? Then it goes into your colon, and in your colon, the more water is absorbed, and it allows for the buildup and solidification of this so that you can have regular defecation rather than sporadic leaking, right? Each day, the alimentary canal processes about 10 liters of food, liquid, and other gastrointestinal secretions. 10 liters is a lot. That's a few gallons. Less than a liter of that gets into the large intestine, so most of that is absorbed well before it gets to the colon. About 90% of the water is absorbed in the small intestine, and the rest is absorbed in the large intestine, right? And then what you get is, in the end, building up in the colon, poop. That rectum, again, has an internal sphincter and an external sphincter. The internal sphincter is smooth muscle. The external sphincter is skeletal muscle. One of those, the outside one you control, the inside one you don't control. I should also mention, by the way, the rectum. Here's an image. The rectum also has sort of transverse folds called rectal valves. Now, if I asked you what that was for, you might not come up with it. But when I tell you, you're going to be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Those rectal valves create folds and spaces that basically allow the feces to separate from the gases, so that when you fart, you don't poop. Now, you don't think about this in your everyday life, but isn't it nice that every time you fart, you don't also poop? Okay, that's it for the gastrointestinal system. I will see you in the next video.